So, we all think we know the story of Pygmalion, right? The brilliant phonetics professor takes a common flower girl and, like magic, turns her into a duchess. But what if I told you the real story isn't about class or even romance? What if it's actually a pretty dark psychological drama hiding in plain sight? Well, today, we're putting Professor Henry Higgins on the couch. And really, that's the big question we're asking here. For the next few minutes, we're going to forget the social commentary, forget the rom-com versions, and instead, we're going to read this play the way a Freudian psychoanalyst would. We're not looking at a hero, we're looking at a patient. Yep, our goal is to shift the whole focus from the fancy London drawing rooms to the messy, complicated space of the unconscious mind. We're going to dig into all of Higgins's weird behaviors, his bizarre relationships, and his obsessions to figure out what is really driving this guy. Okay, so with any patient, you have to ask, where do we start? Well, if you're reading this through a psychoanalytic lens, pretty much all of Higgins's problems, and trust me, there are a lot of them, they all stem from one single core issue, a major unresolved fixation on his mother. Now, this whole idea is rooted in a classic Freudian concept, the Oedipus complex. And what that really means, in simple terms, is that a man just never psychologically separates from his mom. So as an adult, he's still unconsciously holding her up as the one perfect woman, which means every other woman he meets either can't measure up or feels like a direct threat to that special bond. And you know, we don't even have to look hard for the proof. Higgins just comes right out and says it. He tells his own mother to her face that she is his ideal and that he basically can't stand young women. I mean, from a therapist's point of view, that's about as clear a confession as you can get. It's textbook. And this fixation has a really serious consequence. In the language of psychoanalysis, it renders Higgins psychically impotent. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything physical. What it means is that he is completely incapable of directing his romantic or sexual desires, his libido, toward a normal adult partner, because all that energy is still unconsciously tangled up with his mother. So, okay, if the mother fixation is the disease, what are the symptoms? You know, how does this core problem actually show up in his day-to-day life? Let's take a closer look at how he behaves. The first big symptom we see is something called sublimation. This is a fascinating defense mechanism. It's where your mind takes these powerful and often unacceptable urges, like raw sexual energy, and redirects them into something that's seen as respectable. Think work, art, or in the case of Henry Higgins, science. And his entire project with Eliza is just a perfect example of this in action. I mean, look at this. Instead of seeking actual intimacy with a woman, he pours that energy into the science of phonetics. Instead of, procreation, he channels that creative force into birthing a brand new Eliza. The intense, passionate, grueling training schedule, it's all a substitute for a real, physical, passionate relationship. Then you have his second major symptom, his pretty blatant misogyny, right? Higgins is always complaining about women, how they'll ruin his life and mess with his work. A Freudian analyst would hear that and immediately diagnose it as castration anxiety, which sounds intense, but it's really a deep, symbolic fear that a woman will somehow rob him of his power, his freedom, his very manhood. And you see this fear play out perfectly in that famous slipper scene. Higgins just casually asks for his slippers, a simple object, but it symbolizes his domestic comfort, his control over his own space. But when Eliza picks them up and throws them at him, whoa, that is way more than just her being angry. It is a symbolic assault on his authority. And his shock, the reason he's so stunned, isn't just because she yelled at him, it's because in that one moment, the entire power dynamic was terrifyingly flipped on its head. Now, what's really interesting is that Higgins isn't the only one who fits so neatly into this kind of psychological model. If we broaden our view a little bit, you can actually map the other main characters in the play directly onto Freud's famous structure of the human mind. I mean, it lines up almost perfectly. It's kind of amazing. Eliza's dad, Alfred Doolittle, he is the id, through and through. He's driven purely by instinct, by the pleasure principle, and just wants to avoid responsibility at all costs. Then you have Mrs. Higgins, Henry's mother. She is the superego, the voice of conscience, of morality, of what society expects. And poor Eliza? She's the ego, stuck right in the middle, trying desperately to balance her own raw desires with all the strict rules that are being forced on her. So we've put all the pieces together. We have the mother fixation, the sublimation, the deep-seated fears, the way the characters all interact. So what's the verdict? What's our final diagnosis for Professor Henry Higgins? Well, here it is. The diagnosis is that Henry Higgins is a classic narcissist with a profoundly unresolved Oedipus complex. His whole experiment with Eliza, it was never about loving her. It was about proving his own godlike power, an act of self-love. He'd much rather have the death drive, which is all about stasis and perfect, unchanging control, than the messy, chaotic life drive, which involves real emotions and, change. And this brings us to the ultimate psychoanalytic irony of the entire play. You see, the tragedy for Higgins is that his little experiment works too well. In his obsessive quest for control, he accidentally creates a complete, fully formed human being. He gives his statue, his little doll, a voice. And the very first thing she does with it is declare her own independence and completely shatter his fantasy. Which leaves us with one last, kind of haunting question to think about. In the act of creating his perfect woman, Higgins actually created a real one, with her own thoughts and her own will. So, did his obsessive attempt to control love ultimately guarantee that he could never, ever truly experience it?